I invite you to turn with me in your Bibles to Acts chapter 29. Or if you were like my kids, scroll with me on your phones in your Bible app. I'm afraid I'm not as techy as my children are, so I still read paper with ink on it. And if you are able, let me invite you to stand as a sign of reverence for God's Word. This is Acts chapter 24, verses 1 through 9. This is the Word of God. After 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders, this is to Caesarea, with an attorney named Tertullus, and they brought charges to the governor against Paul. After Paul had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying to the governor, "Since we have, through you, attained much peace, and since by your providence reforms are being carried out for this nation, we acknowledge this in every way and everywhere, most excellent Felix, with all thankfulness. But that I may not weary you any further, I beg you to grant us by your kindness a brief hearing. For we have found this man a real pest, and a fellow who stirs up dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. And he even tried to desecrate the temple, and then we arrested him. We wanted to judge him according to our own law, but Lysias, the commander, came along and with much violence took him out of our hands, ordering his accusers to come before you. By examining him yourself concerning all these matters, you will be able to ascertain the things of which we accuse him." The Jews also joined in the attack, asserting that these things were so. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Please be seated. Would you kindly join me in prayer? Father, we ask with the words of my mouth and the meditations on each of our hearts would be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. As we've been continuing our study in the book of Acts, we now find Paul in another trial. And as we mentioned this last quarter or so of the book, the emphasis in the book of Acts is going to move from action and a variety of geographic locations to primarily speeches made by Paul in his defense before a variety of judges. This is the first of the final three, Felix, the next two being Festus and Agrippa. And Paul has already, as you remember, given, if not a thorough defense, at least an overview of his conversion to the Jews who, according to this testimony, were simply trying to keep order in the temple. You remember that? Did anyone grin a little bit when you read, well, we were just trying to keep things orderly, and then here this Lysias comes along and with much violence took him out of our hand. Remember, they're beating him to try to kill him. They're beating him to death. And Lysias comes along and tries to save Paul's life. Well, with much violence. We were just trying to keep order, and then this Roman fellow, with much violence, took him out of our hand. That's not the only humor you'll find in this passage, I trust. But anyway, and then before the Sanhedrin, Paul gave a more specific defense regarding the charges against him, that he sought to desecrate the temple by bringing Trophimus the Ephesian into the forbidden area in Jerusalem, which was not the case. And now we have a formal defense. Now, we will not get to Paul's defense this morning, but this is the first section, which is the accusation. And I thought it propitious to cut it off in verse 9 because I wanted us to think about the significance of Tertullus' accusation against Paul, which is, of course, at the behest of Ananias. And we've already mentioned as a scoundrel. Remember, Ananias was later killed by the Jews for being a sympathizer with Rome, But a few brief comments, and then I want us to think about how Paul's reputation here, and I'm not defending him as a pest, I trust you understand, but that Paul's actions being perceived by some, or even accused by some, falsely of being a pest, might relate to us. A few brief comments here. This would be 5 days, presumably after Paul arrived, although we're going to see later in verse 11, Paul cites 12 days ago. It was no more than 12 days ago that he was in Jerusalem. So presumably it's been 5 days that he was brought to Caesarea. And they hire counsel here. Scholars speculate Tertullus was a Hellenistic Jew. His name, although having the Latin form with a US at the end, the root is Greek. But he's presumably at least sympathetic to the Jews and their cause, if not being Jewish himself ethnically. And Tertullus engages in the rhetoric of the day, flattering Felix. Commentators tell us that if any of the Jews in Palestine could have heard Tertullus flatter Felix by telling him, reforms are being carried out, through you we've attained much peace. This is a total joke. I was surprised to learn that Felix was himself quite the scoundrel, and his rule over Judea was characterized by constant anarchy and riots. There's absolutely nothing characteristic in his rule that had to do with peace or reforms. I did not know anything about Felix before I prepared for this sermon. Perhaps Jim or Brad were taught something about Felix in their seminary courses, but I was completely unfamiliar with him. I was surprised to learn that he was born a slave, but that he took the name Antonius. First name is Antonius Felix. Felix, of course, meaning lucky. And he was lucky, as you might say, because he was adopted by Antonia, who was the mother of the Roman Emperor Claudius. So to be born a slave and then freed and adopted by the mother of Claudius the emperor is quite lucky indeed. He was also his, if you would, stepbrother. Claudius later appointed him to a number of positions. He was known for the chaos that characterized his rule, as well as his pervasive lust, his lifelong lust. He was married 3 times, the first of which, all of the women that he married, the first was a princess in her own right, being the daughter of a Syrian ruler. His third wife that's listed in verse 24 of this passage, Drusilla, was actually his third wife. We don't know much about his second wife, but he was known for his voracious sexual appetite. So there's nothing upstanding about Felix, and we know later that he deliberately, when Paul begins to explain, I don't want to let the cat out of the bag too soon, but if Providence does not allow me to get to this passage later, it is worth pointing out that when Paul apparently senses something in Felix's character that deems it appropriate in verse 25 to discuss righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, it says Felix becomes frightened and says, go away. So Felix here is a man who is not characterized by any standard of self-control, any standard of sexual restraint or righteousness in the way he seeks or seeking justice in his administration. And we're told that when he leaves the scene, he keeps bringing Paul back in verse 26 in hopes that Paul will eventually bribe him, which is apparently his modus operandi in doing everything. So nothing upstanding about Felix, nothing noble about him in any way. But of course, because it was the fashion of the day in the courts to flatter the judge, that's why Tertullus begins the way he does. As well as his language in verse 4, they may not weary you any further. So there are 3 charges brought against Paul. And we've mentioned before that Luke intentionally, both literarily and theologically, draws parallels between Paul and Christ. particularly in this last quarter of the book of Acts, as he makes his way to Jerusalem and faces a variety of trials. And in Luke chapter 23, we read that there were 3 charges brought against Christ, and in the same way there are 3 charges brought against Paul here. The first being, they stirs up dissension. The second, he's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, and that term would have been a pejorative in the ears of Felix. It's the only place in the New Testament where this term is applied to Christians. It was adopted by all Christians early on, but particularly retained by Jewish Christians later. And then the most serious of the 3, and perhaps the most concrete, although still not clearly supported, is that Paul tried to desecrate the temple. So there's these 3 accusations, none of which have any real substance. There is a serious textual variant there at the end of verse 6 to the beginning of verse 8. Suffice it to say that it's from our friend, the Western Family Text that I've mentioned many times before. The reason it's included in the text here is because somehow it found its way into what's called the received text that formed the basis of the King James Version. So out of respect for the King James Version, arguably the editors left it in here. Although one commentator points out it does seem to bear, despite coming from the Western Family, which is spurious in many places, this particular variant seems to have merit because it would explain, by internal logic, it would explain the last phrase in verse 8 when he says, by examining him yourself concerning these matters, you'll be able to ascertain. Lysias was not present, but logically, if we leave the textual variant in, it would mean that Tertullus is asking Felix to examine Lysias. Whereas if you take the textual variant out, the logical application is that he's urging Felix to examine Paul himself by cross-examination, which was not the practice in those days. In any event, scholars do point out that in verse 8, and I didn't catch this, all right, but when you look at it, when someone's told you, which in my case, I'm reading these commentaries, there does seem to be a collapsing of his rhetoric, because he begins with this flourish in verse 5 with all this flattery. In verse 2, Verse 2, he has all this rhetoric where he flatters Felix. And then he has these 3 charges that are summarized. Most scholars think this is just a summary of the arguments. But that verse 8, there seems to be a sudden change of tone from accusation to, well, if you just examine someone else, whether it's Lysias or Paul, you'll be able to figure this out. And then he steps down. Now, grammatically, it's called an anakuthulon. But what it means is that there's almost a change of thought where perhaps Tertullus recognizes that his accusations have no merit on their own, and so he just resorts to saying, well, if you examine them yourself, you'll ascertain these things are true. So, the point here is that the arguments have no substance, that the charges are trumped up, and they're somewhat disingenuous because they're really trying to get Paul prosecuted on the basis of stirring up, fomenting revolt against the state, which is clearly not the case. But in reality, the animus against Paul is motivated by religious reasons. That's really what the issue is. They don't like Paul because he's undermining their authority in the Jewish community, because so many Jews are coming to Christ and seeing him as the Messiah. And they're leaving what might be called Pharisaical Judaism, Sadducean Judaism, traditional Judaism, and they're joining this new sect of the Nazarenes. That's the real reason they're angry. Isn't it interesting that often in the history of the church is persecuted under false pretenses? Now, scholars do point out here that Luke is deliberately showing and he's going to show in Paul's defense, that not just Paul, but Christians in general, the church in general, is not party to sedition. And I think it's worth pointing that out, because I know that some of you, in the hearing of my voice, are of a political persuasion, and I will just tell you, I include myself in this number, who are not particularly happy with the political situation we have. But it's my job as a preacher of the gospel to remind us as Christians that we are not to participate in sedition against the state. I realize that there are historical problems with that. I'll just leave it here by saying that Luke makes it clear that Paul is not someone who's actively seeking to undermine the state as a result of his preaching the gospel. All right, so do whatever you will with 1776, and do whatever you will with January 6th of whatever it was, 2020. All right, whatever your views are on all that, believers are not to be actively seditious. All right. So how might these accusations reflect on our role as Christians in the world? Well, first of all, I think it's pertinent to point out that the preaching of Christ always has and always will bring two responses. Now, you may remember in our series through 2 Corinthians that Paul, in a number of places, mentions the persecutions he experienced, the rejection he experienced. You remember at the end of 2 Corinthians chapter 2, Paul says, "But thanks be to God, who always leads us in triumph in Christ and manifests through us the sweet aroma in the knowledge of him in every place. For we are a fragrance of Christ to God among those who are being saved." And he just ends there, right? You know he doesn't end there, right? We are the fragrance of Christ to God among those who are being saved and among those who are perishing. To the one, an aroma of peace and prosperity and how to live your best life now. Right? That's the Oprah Winfrey gospel, right? Now, I'm going to name names here. If you're upset about it, as my children would say, I think the Generation Z term for it is you can cope harder. Have you heard Generation Z use that phrase? Maybe not. Cope harder. Okay, I'm going to get myself in trouble. Have you ever seen T.D. Jakes on the Oprah Winfrey Show? T.D. Jakes is not even a Trinitarian, all right? He's a modalist. But he's a prosperity preacher. He's got a net worth of something like $100 million, flies his private jet around and does seminars on how to. He famously said once that he gives money to God so that God will owe him. Oh. All right, if you doubt me, look it up on YouTube. He believes that by giving to God, he owes us. And so that's the way he twists God's arm to make him prosperous for his private jet and all that. And Oprah Winfrey loves it, right? And not surprisingly, when he's confronted on the issue of sexuality, he says his view on homosexuality is evolved and evolving. Evolved and evolving. But he's interviewed on CNN about that. Anyway. So, Paul says, we are a fragrance of Christ to God among those who are being saved, among those who are perishing. To the one, an aroma from death to death. To the other, an aroma from life to life. That is the response of the gospel in the world. So do not be surprised that to some, the gospel is the aroma of death to death. There's nothing good about it. They don't want it. All right? Now, some of you will say, now, Shelby, I know that while you're an amillennialist that you call yourself an optimistic amillennialist. Don't you, aren't you contradicting yourself here? Right? Don't you think that the gospel is going to have an effect in the whole world? And aren't you just a hair's breadth away from postmillennialism? Well, maybe more than a hair's breadth away, but I do consider myself an optimistic amillennialist, right? I do think that eventually that the gospel is going to have great fruit in the world. Right? I think the gospel is going to bear a lot of fruit in the world. But the nice, tidy thing about being amillennial is that as the gospel progresses, that there will also be evil in the world. There's an acknowledgement that the world will never be, before the return of Christ, will never be completely transformed. I believe that that's going to happen after Christ returns and restores the creation. But even if you're inclined to be postmillennial, I'm addressing this because this is the issue that separates premillennials from postmillennials. I mean, the outcome at least. Because our premillennial brothers will say, hold on, we read the New Testament and we see that persecution will increase. We see that there's always going to be opposition to the gospel. And I think we do well to take that and remember that there is always going to be opposition to the gospel. Paul says that here. That's reflected in this accusation against Paul. And Paul says it here in 2 Corinthians 2, that there's always going to be those who hear the gospel as an aroma from death to death. And by the way, it is ironic in verse 14, just for what it's worth, remember I mentioned this before, that when the word that Paul uses for triumph is the image of the Romans who would bring the conquered forces who were their enemies as slaves into Rome, and they would lead them in a triumphal procession, and the general would be at the front, and then the victorious army, and then all the captured enemies who were now slaves are being, usually with ropes around their necks, and have their hands bound behind them, and they're led with their necks, and those are the people who are being led in triumph. And Paul applies that to the Christians, specifically the apostles, but the Christians are the ones who are being led. But we're slaves of Christ who've been conquered, not by the enemy, but conquered by Christ. All right. So, point number one, if you're taking notes, is the gospel is always going to be the aroma of death to death of those who are not, as Paul says here, being saved. Those who are dying, those who are perishing. Okay. Number two, while believers should never seek to be pests per se, sometimes being faithful to Christ will result in appearing to be a pest. All right? While believers are never to seek to be pests per se, sometimes being faithful will lead to being perceived as pests. Now here I would cite the infamous church that I think is somewhere in Kansas, but I'm not sure. You've heard of the Westboro Baptist Church, right? They're the ones who would famously go to these military funerals and protest and make obnoxious signs, and they really were pests, right? And I'm of the opinion they were being pests on purpose, right? That was their objective, right? Maybe as a free speech test case or something, I don't know. I don't believe Christians are called to be pests per se. I don't think that it's glorifying to Christ for Christians to go out of their way to be abrasive, out of their way to be obnoxious, to go out of their way to shove things in people's faces or find the most controversial things and elevate them to the level of central issues of the faith. But I do believe that sometimes being faithful will mean that sometimes we state things in such a way, speak the truth in love. Paul says to do it with gentleness and respect. Peter says to do it with gentleness and respect. Paul says the Lord's servants must not be quarrelsome but gentle to all, even to those who oppose. That believers can sometimes be regarded as pests when they're being faithful with Christ. We see that in the life of Christ. I don't think Christ went out of his way to be a pest for its own sake, but I think that often Christ confronted those whose influence was inhibiting, or would seek to inhibit, the kingdom of God in the life of Israel. So he spoke to the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, often spoke with gentleness to those who came to him humbly, like the Syrophoenician woman falls at his feet. He's gentle with them, but he's harsh with those who are opposing not just him on a personal level, but I believe we're opposing the kingdom of God. So sometimes God may call you to be perhaps a little more forthright than you feel comfortable being. Sometimes calling you to maybe press things a little more than social convention might allow. I think of the well-known pastor in California, and his name is escaping me right now. Perhaps someone else can help me. He was the Asian guy who sort of took a vow of poverty as a way of eschewing the prosperity gospel. He was the Asian guy, and he later left. He went to China, and he was impressed with the house church movement there and began to start a house church. You guys don't know, I can't remember. All right. But he told the story once about being invited to play golf with this guy who was not a believer. And he would play golf and make small talk, but then he would gently say something about Christ. And early on in the golf game, the guy says, "I don't want to talk about this." So he backs off and then makes small talk for a few more holes, and then gently brings something else up about Christ. And the guy says, "No, I really don't want to talk about this right now." And he says, "Oh, but come on, you got to have an opinion one way or the other, you know." And it came to my mind because I'm sure he was being deferential and being nice, but he was being a little bit persistent, you know. Now, where that line is, I don't know. I don't know. Some people have a gift at that. I'm not gifted at that. But I will say this, you know, this past week I went to my friend's funeral, my next door neighbor who was killed in the line of duty. And I've talked about the gospel with him. We had him over at our house. I encouraged him. I gave him a book to read. I don't know if he ever did. I would often bring up spiritual things with him. And I understand that he's, wherever he is with Christ, wherever he is for eternity, is ultimately not my fault. But I tell you, I wish I'd been a little more forthright with him. I wish I'd been a little more persistent. I don't believe that if my friend, my neighbor, is in hell right now, that it is my fault. But I just tell you, it would have been nice, I think, to have been a little bit more intentional with him, maybe be a little more persistent. Point number 3, even if the world considers us to be pests, God will always use the gospel for his kingdom. He will always use it for his kingdom. And in the case of Paul here, he was a pest in the eyes of the Jews. Now, I thought to bring it earlier this week, and then I forgot. So I get a pass because I have permanent chemo brain, okay? But I have a book on my shelf at home, and the book is entitled The 100. And I don't remember the author's name, but he's an historian, a college professor, teaches history at some school. And this book is probably 30 years old, but it was his, and of course, in academia, everything is an opinion, right? But it was his opinion of the 100 figures in history that he thought had influenced the course of history more than any other. So of course it's going to be subjective, right? And of course the attempt to rank them is even more subjective. And you and I may disagree with his assessment. But for whatever it's worth, you may be surprised, as I was, to find that the Apostle Paul was number 1 on the list. That's his opinion. To the best of my knowledge, he was not a professing Christian. I have no reason to think that. He taught at a state university. Not that that proves you're not a Christian. It's our esteemed brother here who's visiting with us, who's a professor at a state university here in Pest. But it was his opinion that the Apostle Paul, through his ministry in expanding Christianity, had more of an influence on the history of the world than any other individual. Now, number 2, in his opinion, was Muhammad. Number 3 was Jesus. All right? And he sought to defend his ranking by saying, well, Christ began what he considered the Christian faith, but Paul is the one who expanded it. Now, you can differ about that if you will. But the point I'm making is, no one can disagree that Paul had a profound effect on the history of the world, even though the Jews at the time considered him a pest. Who knows if you decide just to push the envelope a little bit, just to be, if you say, well, I'm just going to be that guy at the party. I had a friend in college who would go to frat parties for the purpose of sharing the gospel. He was a guy named Brock. Can't remember his last name. No. But we were in the same Bible study. He was a tall guy, athletic, kind of a GQ looking kind of guy. Do you know what I'm talking about? But man, he was totally sold out as an evangelist. And he would go, he's like, I'm going to try to hit he said, he would talk about the parties he would try to go to. He's like, I'm going to see if I can get to the SAE party this weekend, And he'd go to the party, you can argue how effective it is to share the gospel with people after they're 3 sheets to the wind. But I'm just going to tell you, man, he made an effort of it, all right? And he'd go there, and he'd talk about Christ with anybody who'd sit down there, if they were drunk or sober, Who knows? Who knows what effect he had? I don't know. But God says he's going to always use his word to accomplish something in his kingdom. Okay? It might be to harden the reprobate, but there might be some people who would hear it as the aroma of life to life. So maybe if you're that guy at the party, maybe if you're at the family reunion, you decide to, I know that this person didn't want to hear it, but I'm just going to say a little something. God can use that. I don't know what God will use in the way that he will use it, but I know he's going to do something with it. He's going to do something with it. Maybe it's with a coworker. Maybe it's with someone in your neighborhood. He will use it. He will use it. And even if that person thinks you're a pest, they thought Paul was a pest, and God used it. Would you join me in prayer? Help us, Father, we pray, not to shrink back from the name of Christ. Give us grace, we pray, to confess him before men, before women, before children, before people who are opposed to him. Give us grace to trust you with it. In Christ's name, amen.